Hello and welcome. And today I'm very pleased to introduce Mike McInnes. He is a former pharmacist, and today we're going to talk about all things honey. Yes, that's honey from bees, and who knew it could be such a controversial subject? Mike has a very interesting hypothesis on the fact that a diet in ultra-processed foods high in carbohydrates and refined sugars is a highly contributing factor to the rising levels of neurological disorders, causing things such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, and autism, to name a few. In his recently published book, The Honey Sapiens, he examines this further, which is what we're going to talk about today. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much. Nice of you to have me.
I'm very interested to hear a little bit about your background, from how you moved from being a pharmacist to being an advocate of honey.
Okay, during my pharmaceutical years, I became interested in sports nutrition. And I went on to specialize in that because I understood that when you're exercising, you're rapidly losing glucose, which fuels the brain, from the liver. So I looked for a product that could refuel the liver. That's why at the end of a race, often athletes can hardly remember their own name, never mind function normally, you know. They haven't got enough fuel for the brain. And I found that the best way to do that was to use honey, because honey contains fructose, and fructose is specific to the liver, where it's converted to glucose and stored for the brain. The liver is the brain's fuel store. And so we developed that, and then I became into, and the way to do that was to use honey, because honey has glucose and fructose nicely balanced. So we produced a product which was very successful, and I became very, very interested in honey. And I then went on to study, to look at studies on honey, which improved health in a variety of ways. Now that was in the early 2000s, but at that time every doctor and every health professional said honey was just the same as sugars. And that is not correct, it's completely wrong. These studies were published around the world, not in Europe or America, where this belief that honey was just the same as other sugars was the case, and is still largely the case today. But they were published in China, Japan, India, Korea, Malaysia in particular, Middle East, Africa, and South America. And they were largely ignored. And that really is still the case. So the knowledge of honey and its benefits is not known in the West, but is known elsewhere around the world. Now, these studies were published in Western peer-reviewed journals. This is the interesting thing, but they were completely ignored, and they still are. I can give you an example of that. There's a lovely study published we've just seen figures that say that obesity in children is still a massive problem and growing. Now, honey prevents the damage that the sugars do to the brain, which is the initial cause of obesity. And a study was published, a joint study was published just recently by the National Institute of Health in America, which said that honey was beneficial in preventing obesity. And that was a year ago, and nobody has cited that study in 1 year. There should be hundreds, thousands of citations, not one. So it's a lovely study, but it's completely ignored.
And I mean, I think I was brought up to believe that honey was good for you. I think that's in our culture that it's, so why has honey got this bad rap, for want of a bad word, and why does the academic world seem to be against it?
Well, basically in 1958, an American doctor, a physician from Vermont, published a folklore book on honey, which he claimed honey could cure a variety of diseases like rheumatism and blood pressure, high blood pressure and so on. And there was no science in the book. It was without any scientific backup. And it became a bestseller, led the New York Times book list for 2 years, I think it was. And then the FDA seized the book and destroyed it because there was no scientific evidence put forward in the book. Now that meant from then until now, people would not believe that honey had any benefits. But from about 2000 onwards, studies began to appear around the world which showed that honey is completely different to the fine sugars. It has a variety of benefits, which include the prevention of neurological damage, which causes obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and autism. And it's largely the case that these studies are still ignored, you know. But they were published and one of the reasons, some of the early scientists who did the work on honey from about 2000 onwards were Islamic scientists, because in Islamic culture, honey is revered. So they were the initial ones, but there were others as well. But because there's also this prejudice, oh, well, these are just Islamic researchers and they love honey. So it means that the science, according to this view, is not correct. But the key point to understand there is that these studies were published in Western journals, peer-reviewed Western journals, but then they were ignored. So that's that. It's just a curious historical incident, but it meant that people would look with an open mind at what honey was and what it could do. West, people in the West.
So you're on a mission to try to promote, once again, the, you know, I think lots of people might say magical benefits of honey, and in particular look at how this can be substituted for all the refined sugars that we all have in all our ultra processed foods.
Yes, exactly, because honey contains what are known as bioflavonoids. They're amazing molecules which have been around for about 500 million years. The honeybee sources these bioflavonoids from wildflowers, and it has done so for 100 million years. So it's an ancient food or fuel, if you like. And when the honeybee flies, its level of sugars in its circulation, which is called the hemolymph, goes up to about 50 times the level of sugars in humans. Okay. So that means its brain should be homogenized into neurological minestrone, but it's not, because it's protected. Its brain is protected by these fabulous bioflavonoids, and there's many of them. You know, all honey contains them. You know, different ones in different honeys. So honey, it's not magical at all. It's scientifically the most neuroprotective and anti-diabetic fuel, brain fuel known to man, known to mankind.
And is all honey the same honey, or does it depend where the bees come from and what they're feeding on?
Of course. There's about 30 that we know of these bioflavonoids. Different honeys from different flower sources contain different ones, but they're all hugely beneficial. They protect the brain, the honeybee brain, and our brain against the damage that refined sugars cause to the brain. All of the insults that sugars inflict on the human brain, honey protects us against those insults, our brains.
Right. So, I mean, we all know that, it's very, very popular at the moment about ultra processed foods. We all know that sugar is very bad for us. Presumably, there is lots of evidence to prove the effect it has on our neurological side pathways of sugar.
Yeah, what sugar does is the brain gets its energy by a fuel pump, and its fuel pump is an enzyme called glutamine synthetase. It's not a nice word, but it's an ancient enzyme. It's been around for about 3 billion years, and it's the fuel pump in the brains of all animal species, including humans, and it pumps glucose into the brain. So, but basically, it's like a mechanical fuel pump. If you overwhelm the fuel pump, the engine cuts out. That's what happens with this enzyme. So it's an absolutely beautiful enzyme. and it pumps glucose each time. It converts a toxic amino acid called glutamate into a benign one, a beneficial one called glutamate. And each time it does that, it pumps a glucose molecule into the brain for transfer to the neurons to provide the neurons with the energy that allows us to think and communicate and to have language, to write poetry or books or whatever. So it's a beautiful enzyme, but it's refined sugars destroy that enzyme. Excess refined sugars. We must say that, because if you have a normal diet without an excess, then that works perfectly. It's only when there's too much glucose in the blood.
And what about the argument that obviously you can't, that honey has, as I understand it, has a much higher, I don't know what you would call it, a higher sugar content than actual refined sugar?
Well, it's not higher, but it's if you take a teaspoonful of sugar, okay, into your coffee, you're basically digesting your brain, okay?
Oh, God.
That's what you're doing, yeah? Because knocking down the enzyme sets off an inflammatory storm which digests neurons, cooks them and digests them in the brain. But if you provide the same amount of sugar in the honey in your tea or your coffee, you're protecting your brain because of these ancient bioflavonoids. Now that science is not known in the academic or the health professional world. It's just not known at all.
When you say it's not known, is that because they're not aware of it, or?
Yeah, they're not aware of it. The science is there if they want to look for it.
Right.
All that I have done in the book is collated the studies from all around the world to show what honey can do, and also at the same time to show the neurological damage that sugars do. So there's two things there that have to be understood by the public. Now, we have to go over the heads of the health professionals and most of the academics, because they just won't look at that science. You know, every doctor, every health professional I ever spoke to said to me, no, honey is just the same as sugars over the period of my professional life. Now, they said that with great confidence, but they were actually talking nonsense. You know?
But the positive news is, I think, very much that there is very much a sway now that calories, not all calories are the same calories.
Exactly, that's correct. Yes.
And so hopefully this is something to, to support your argument that, what you're trying to push forward.
Yes. Sugar calories are different to protein calories or to fat calories. They're very different, and they act different, So basically, also, if you produce too much, if you've got too much sugar in your circulation, then the pancreas pumps out too much insulin. And that's equally bad, because that also shuts down that enzyme. So, insulin is good if it's in the right quantity. But if you have too much sugar in the circulation, as most of the Western society, and now globally, people have too much sugar in the circulation. And the brain is constantly being deprived of the energy it needs that pumps gives to it. So the brain is constantly deprived of energy. That means it's hungry, starving. So the more sugar calories you have in your circulation, the hungrier is the brain. It's always short of fuel. Consequently, cognition is declining it dramatically, enormously, So, but the same mechanism is at work in obesity and in diabetes type 2 and in Alzheimer's and in autism. In autism, it's much more potent because it's happening before the baby is born. And you need this enzyme to develop the brain in fetus.
And that's because the sugar or the glucose level in the mother is transferred directly into the fetus.
It goes into the fetal circulation and causes a problem. But the problem there is when the brain is developing. So the damage is so much greater. So consequently, when the infant emerges, the brain is deprived of energy, so cognition is damaged, communication is damaged, and language is damaged. And also, autistic babies have enormous problems with vision. So because vision is one of the systems which is most damaged by sugars. You know, if you're type 2 diabetic, you're likely to go blind if you're not careful. You know, that's the leading cause of blindness in the world.
And so what you're saying is that substituting refined sugars with honey, because the bioflavonoids,
yes,
the honey is the actual thing that does the protection against all these, you know, brain issues.
That's beautifully. That's perfectly put. The honey bioflavonoids protect the brain against every insult that refined sugars inflict on it.
Gosh.
And it's remarkable.
Mm.
Therefore, if instead of having, you know, people say, children get diabetes. Okay. Now, the leading cause of diabetes in the Western was fats, so they took fats out of the food and put sugars in. You know, that was also nonsense. You know.
Mm.
So I mean, children don't have fats in their snacks and in their drinks, do they? They have sugars. And children are now diabetic.
Yes. Well, and obviously you're, you know, from your background of sports stuff, I mean, all we see now are these supposed sports bars that are very, very high in sugar.
Yeah, the athletes consume more refined carbohydrates than any other population in the history of human evolution. Okay, because they have very high carbohydrate diets and they drink these drinks during training. Now, athletes are liable to get motor neuron disease, which kills them because of the amount of refined sugars that they consume in their diets. Now, that's only it's 6 times in athletes, motor neuron disease, 6 times the level of the general population. And the enzyme, the gene that causes it, because there's only a certain portion of athletes are genetically vulnerable. What sets the gene in motion that causes the disease is refined sugars. So that gene is activated by sugars. So if they're training, they should be training with honey and not with high levels of sugar-dense drinks, which are ultimately damaging.
And so, you know, moving on to practically, and I know that your book is very much setting out what your hypothesis is and how to, you know, how we can start telling, or how you can start telling everyone to make them aware. What are the sort of the hints and tips that you would say to people that they could incorporate into their sort of day-to-day life?
Okay, the first thing to do is throw out the sugar bowl. Get rid of it. Don't ever use refined sugars if you know. Secondly, sleep is a big question here, you know, because we go to bed with after an early evening meal in the West, okay? So consequently, the liver store for the brain overnight is very small and it rapidly depletes. So if you go to bed after a meal at 7 o'clock, if you have your evening meal at around 7 o'clock, 6 or 7 o'clock, the brain doesn't have an 8-hour fast, it's got a 12-hour fast. That's catastrophic for the brain. So what happens is you go to bed and the brain can see the liver and can see how little fuel it's got. Yeah? It goes into stress to create more glucose by breaking down protein. So you can't sleep properly. There's a massive epidemic of insomnia in the world globally. And that's because people don't have enough fuel in their brain, in their liver, to supply the brain overnight. So they can't get, and of course, for children, that's catastrophic because you learn when you're sleeping. That's when you transfer your short-term memories into long-term in the hippocampus. So it's having a drastic effect. And if you then go into metabolic stress, which is the stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, then you increase your risk of diabetes, obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, these 3 conditions. You know? So sleep is a major question. So if you take, before you go to bed, take a tablespoon of honey. If you're an adult, a child would maybe be 2 teaspoons or something like that.
And that's not going to spike your is that going to spike your glucose level though?
No. It stabilizes blood glucose overnight.
Right. Okay.
The liver releases glucose from its store, which is called glycogen, which is just like starch, gradually over the night, and supplies the brain. So you don't get a massive spike in blood glucose with honey at night. It doesn't happen. So that's a key thing that people can improve their lifestyles by just refueling the liver before they go to bed. So you put 2 teaspoons of honey in. You can have it in water. You can have it in a nice herb tea, or so I usually take it with herb tea, and it has a dramatic improvement not only on your sleep pattern but on your recovery, because that's when you repair and you grow when you're sleeping.
Right.
So it's key. That's a key thing. Then in the morning, just take honey with your breakfast, because you now want to because that's depleted overnight. So you replace your, if you go down an urban street, okay, when you go into stress overnight, that drives up blood glucose. So you get up in the morning with morning diabetes, okay? Now that does 2 things, okay? First of all, too much glucose in your blood pulls water out of the brain by reverse osmosis, okay? So in any urban street in the morning, you see people carrying water bottles. That's because their brains are dehydrated. Now, at the same time, that excess glucose in the circulation prevents glucose getting into the brain because it shuts down the pump. So others are going about with coffee to get caffeine to reboot their brains. And that's 2 forms of behavior which are directly the result of too much sugar in the blood when you get up in the morning, because you haven't refueled your liver before bed. In the Mediterranean, they used to eat at 11 o'clock at night, healthy food.
Yeah.
They would sleep, and they would get the benefit of that. Protects your heart, protects your cognition, protects your long-term memory. There's all sorts of benefits come from that. And then replenish your liver again in the morning with a dose of honey, with your breakfast and your porridge or cereal or whatever you want to take. That's a nice thing to do. And then you avoid processed foods and high sugar food. When you go into a supermarket, if a product says low fat, healthy, it's low fat, that's nonsense. It's extremely unhealthy. And the supermarkets are full of these foods. This is a tragedy, a massive international tragedy, because as a result of that unfortunate incident with the American doctors in 1958. So,
I don't understand the science. I'm certainly not somebody to judge it, but me on the face of it, it sounds that what you're saying is logical, but I'm absolutely not medical in any shape or form. So if this is the case, how are you trying to go? What are you trying to do? Is it trying to speak to the food industry or to the doctors and the academics?
Yeah, first of all, I have to persuade the honey industry.
What, they don't believe it?
No, they've been taking their information from Western academics and health institutions. So consequently, first of all, I've got to do is first of all persuade and that is happening. It's beginning to happen. But by and large, they take their information from the Western scientific canon, which says honey is just like sugars, and they have had to buy into that because these are the people that advised the beekeepers and the beekeeping industry and the honey producers. So they're have been very, very hesitant to say, "Oh, come on, you can't say these things."
That seems madness, when you would feel it was in their best interest to be promoting the positivity.
They were terrified to oppose the medical establishment. And also at the same time, the sugar industry, which is globally massive, receives billions in subsidies from governments in the West. The honey industry gets no help at all. So obviously, it's good that we can help. speaking to beekeeping groups now, and they're beginning to pick up on this.
Mm.
That's a process that's ongoing, and then I want to reach the public.
Yes.
So the public are the key, because they'll have to figure, is this guy talking nonsense or is it scientifically valid? And so because we have to all go over the heads of the health institutions and most of academia, then it's a battle, but it's a battle we'll win because we're on the right side of science.
Well, and I think also what, especially over the last, literally the last year, the concern about ultra processed foods,
yes,
and refined sugars, it's, anybody that reads anything about health is very, very aware of it.
yes.
And it's definitely coming out more in the press about, just because, a diet substitute for a fizzy drink isn't any better for you at all than one that has got full sugar in it, because of the substitutes that they're also using. So I think everyone's becoming more and more aware of sugar and the what I was going to say, the badness. I mean, how toxic sugar is in our day-to-day life. So I think you've got I would imagine you'd have a lot of people's ear on the basis that you feel that you have something that is a active substitute that is already readily available to everybody.
Exactly. Yes, that's right. You just, the notion, when I was in pharmacy, until I began to look at honey from a scientific point of view, I would have just said the same as everybody else. Oh, it's just the same as refined sugars. But it's nothing like that. It's entirely different. So there, the more we can get people to understand, first of all, people are not going to look at the science if the doctor says to them, no, don't pay any attention to that. That's all nonsense, which is what most of them will say, or any health profession, including my own profession. So therefore, we have a task on our hands, but it's a task that we're on the right side of the science, the right side of history, if you think. And that when we understand why there's been this absolute nonsense spoke about honey for decades, then we can begin to say, well, let's just see what we can do. And the practical things people can do, and avoiding these products in the supermarket that say low in fat. Fat consumption hasn't changed in about half a century. It's virtually the same. The only thing that's gone up is sugars. Massively so.
Gosh, well, all I can say is I wish you well with your book, which is Honey, I can never get it in focus. Honey Sapiens, which is a great name.
Okay.
It's definitely a very interesting read, although it is quite detailed for me. But I think it's necessary if you are going to tackle the academics. They need to have the full facts. They need to see the evidence that you have available to start changing their minds.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, there was no point in publishing a book which didn't have the scientific validation. Now, that scientific validation is all over the world, but not known in the West at all, So therefore, the task I had was to bring all that science together, to collate it, and to put it into a form that would be both acceptable to a popular science form, but also academically and scientific.
And I think it's a mix of you need to get the sway of both the public opinion behind it or understanding it, along with the healthcare professionals and academia. So I absolutely wish you well on your quest, and I'll be very interested to see what happens in the next year or two, because I think this is the time that if you're going to manage to do a breakthrough with your information, it's going to be now.
Yes, and I'm going to do some short films, which I'll be able to disseminate through Twitter.
Okay, lovely. Well, we'll publish all your information on the website with your article, and people can read and make up their own minds.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Mike. It was really nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.